the end of my forum on pilgrimage, I invited you to describe pilgrimages you might like to take. And I said that if I were going on a pilgrimage, I'd want to go to the great medieval European cathedrals. So when Joe asked me to do another forum, I quickly settled on cathedrals as my topic. And so this is a COVID-style pilgrimage. At the time, I had some idea about what that forum would look like, but this forum is not it. As frequently happens when I start looking into something, I learn a lot and travel down some interesting byways, and that's what happened here. So this forum has 3 parts. What is a cathedral? The Gothic cathedral, and pilgrimages to some cathedrals, but not as many as I thought I could fit in, which is why we're going to have another forum next month called More Cathedrals.
Very good.
What is a cathedral anyway? Is it just a big, beautiful church? For many people, that's definition enough. But there is actually a formal definition of a cathedral as the seat or home church of a bishop, from the Latin cathedral or seat. So that's easy, right? If there's a bishop, there's a cathedral. Not exactly. Some denominations, such as Roman Catholics, Anglicans, and Eastern Orthodox, have an ecclesiastical hierarchy that includes bishops. So yes, these denominations are likely to have cathedrals, but not all bishops have cathedrals. The state of Virginia has 3 Episcopal diocesan bishops, but only our own Diocese of Virginia has a cathedral. The Church of the Latter-day Saints has bishops, but those are not ordained individuals and they don't have cathedrals. And in the Orthodox tradition, a city with 1 bishop may have multiple cathedrals, some just blocks from each other. And just as there are some independent congregations that designate a long-serving cleric with the honorific bishop, there are some churches that self-designate as cathedrals. One that comes to mind is the Christian Cathedral in Garden Grove, California, which was touted as the largest glass building in the world, seating 10,000 when it opened as an evangelical megachurch in 1980. As it happens, this ministry had a messy bankruptcy in 2012, and the building was purchased by the Catholic Church and is now an official cathedral in that denomination.
Wow.
So the definition of a cathedral is starting to get slippery. If the cathedral is the seat of the bishop and the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, this must mean that St. Peter's in Vatican City should be considered primus inter pares, the first among equals of cathedrals. Well, no, St. Peter's is not a cathedral. It's a basilica. What? What's a basilica? A basilica is a big, beautiful church like a cathedral, but it has certain privileges bestowed on it by the Pope. The Pope has designated 4 major basilicas, all in Rome, and more than 1,800 others worldwide. To add further to the confusion, however, basilica also refers to a certain architectural style of a church. So a church that is not Roman Catholic and designated a basilica by the Pope may actually consider and call itself a basilica. And actually, the official seat of the Pope as Bishop of Rome is St. John Lateran, not St. Peter's. And while we think of cathedrals as primarily religious entities, many throughout history and even today often hold a place in the secular life of a society. Examples of this are as the site of coronations, royal weddings, wartime targets, state funerals, and even political assassinations. So the question of what a cathedral does not have a simple answer after all. But today I'm going to talk about the particular cathedral form that I love, the Gothic Cathedral, the large churches of Western Europe that were built as Roman Catholic places of worship in the Middle Ages. And I am not the only person who loves these buildings, else why would people from all over the world have watched in horror and sorrow as Notre Dame in Paris burned in April 2019? Why do these structures hold such a fascination for me? One reason, I think, is that I'm a very goal-oriented person. I like to see results from my work. Each month I work on Inspire, and each month I can print out a copy of the issue and hold it in my hand. But cathedrals have a much, much longer timeline, decades, sometimes even centuries. And I have to admire the architects, the workmen, the masons, the artisans and artists who came to work day in and day out for something they would not see completed in their lifetime. What was their satisfaction? Why were cathedrals being built? And not just in one place, but in scores of places and many at the same time in history. Why did people build a cathedral anyway? These are some of the byways I wandered down. Let's start with what a Gothic cathedral is. It is a large, beautiful church which at least started its life as a Roman Catholic church, primarily in Western Europe, and most particularly in France, and which has certain common architectural features. In earlier presentations on the saints and arts, I talked briefly about the development of church architecture when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. All of a sudden, there were many Christians and they did not have to meet in secret in homes. They wanted places of worship that comported with the importance of Christianity as the imperial religion. Many of the temples from the classical period were not suitable for conversion to Christian churches. First, you would not want to worship where people had worshiped pagan gods. But secondly, the buildings were not adaptable because in those religions, the priests were inside the temple and the people were on the outside. In Christianity, however, the people needed to be in the place of worship, where they could see the altar and the celebration of the Eucharist, which form the core of Christian worship. This called for a different type of sacred architecture. The form of the Roman building known as the basilica, which was primarily a civic building, could, with ease by adding a fourth wall, become a church, and many of the large early Christian churches were patterned on this model. You will recall, however, that only 150 years after Constantine's conversion, the Western Roman Empire fell to the barbarians. While large, beautiful Christian churches continued to be built in the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, there were no large, beautiful churches being built in Western Europe for centuries, until about the time of Charlemagne, when he tried to revive the Western Empire as the Holy Roman Empire in about the year 800. But it wasn't until about 1000 CE that the large cathedrals became more prevalent in Western Europe. Christianity was now well established, and with the cessation of hostilities on the borders, attention turned once again to building churches that reflected the status of the church in society. The architectural type of cathedral in this era was Romanesque, characterized by large, heavy columns, little interior light, rounded arches, and few decorative flourishes. The birth of the Gothic cathedral occurred about 2 centuries later at Saint-Denis outside Paris. But let's be clear, the Gothic cathedral did not come out of nowhere like Athena from the head of Zeus. Students of church architecture can trace the development of each of the distinct features of a Gothic cathedral from their origins in Romanesque churches and see how they developed over time. And when we look at Gothic cathedrals today, we have to be aware that many were added to or reconstructed over time, so we are not always looking at the original form of the cathedral. Let's talk about a few of the distinct architectural features that make a Gothic cathedral, starting with the design. Note that the interior of a Gothic cathedral still follows the old basilica design of center space and narrower side aisles. What changed over time, actually before the Gothic cathedral era, but what became a standard of Gothic churches, was the addition of transepts, these things here, or 2 side wings that not only provided more space for worshipers, but made the church into a cross, with the high altar where Christ's head would have been on the crucifix. The top of the cross, or apse, was traditionally rounded. In addition to the overall layout, another distinctive feature of the Gothic cathedral is the roof. Church roofs evolved from wood, which could be eaten by termites or subjected to fire, to stone, which was expensive and heavy, leading to narrow interior spaces with massive support columns with few small windows found in Romanesque church. Over time, the techniques developed to provide greater support for the roof. the barrel vault, the arcade barrel vault, the groin vault, and various forms of rib vaulting, which got progressively more elaborate. These various vaulting techniques, along with the flying buttresses that transferred some of the weight of the building from the foundational pillars, allowed Gothic buildings to grow ever taller, but also allowed the walls to open up with more windows, bringing more light into the interior of the church. The taller buildings had above the nave a triforium and sometimes a gallery, and then clerestory windows. And speaking of windows, a third distinguishing feature of Gothic cathedrals is the windows. Not only are there more of them, but they have changed from rounded to pointed, sending a subtle message that lifts the worshiper's eyes upward to God. The rose or round window, generally at the entrance and at the end of the transepts, is also a Gothic innovation, with the rose-shaped windows signifying heavens. The final distinguishing feature that I want to mention is the decoration. Gothic cathedrals are sometimes called the Bible of the poor. Recall that many of those attending services would have been illiterate, and the Mass, even the sermon, was in Latin. The decorations told the stories of our faith, starting with the elaborate sculptures at the tympanum over the entrance door. A common theme of these sculptures is the Last Judgment, with Christ in the middle and the saved and the damned flanking him. A second common theme for this prominent position was the life of Mary, as many of the Gothic cathedrals, not just Notre Dame in Paris, were also named Notre Dame in honor of Mary. The jamb statues on either side of the cathedral doors generally featured prophets, apostles, martyrs, or saints, particularly venerated in the locale. And let's not forget the gargoyles on the roof. They serve the practical purpose of spouts and drains to direct the rain away from the cathedral walls. These carvings were frequently monsters or grotesques, not saint. And because cathedrals did not have pews, the people stood or knelt, floors were generally beautifully decorated with geometric patterns or labyrinths. Stone artwork could be found inside the cathedral as well, on walls and columns, along with paintings, frescoes, and murals, and of course, the stained glass windows. From previous presentations, you may remember that I am interested in iconography and hidden meaning in artwork. So that's probably one of the reasons I love cathedrals. There is so much detail to be absorbed and interpreted. There are a number of themes to be decoded in the decorations of cathedrals. There's the Trinity, the life of Mary, and the Last Judgment. Some others are obvious: the apostles, good versus evil, the communion of saints, and stories from the Bible, such as the wise and foolish virgins. This parable from our gospel this morning is a very common theme found in at least a dozen cathedrals, frequently incorporated in the decoration related to the Last Judgment, with a wise virgin on the side of those going to heaven and a foolish virgin on the side of those going to hell. Other themes might be less obvious, like one I just learned about called the Mystic Mill. In these depictions, which can be found in at least 3 cathedrals that I have read about, Moses is seen pouring the grain of the Old Testament tablets into a mill, and the flour from the mill is coming out and being captured by Paul, or sometimes by Peter and Paul. I think this is charming. This allegory must have been a common understanding among Christians in the Middle Ages, but demonstrates how much the modern visitor might overlook in understanding all of the messages that the cathedral is meant to impart. I mean, how would you even find this small decoration in the vastness of a Gothic cathedral, particularly since in one of the cathedrals it appears as the capital of a tall column? So these are some of the features, along with the period of construction in the years roughly 1150 to 1500 or so, that make a Gothic cathedral. Does this mean that every church considered a Gothic cathedral has all of them? No. Does this mean that every Gothic cathedral looks alike? Definitely no. There are also, if you will, subgenres of Gothic cathedrals, such as the flamboyant or the English perpendicular style. As Professor William Cook has said, There's no cookie cutter Gothic cathedral. Now that we've talked about the what and how of Gothic cathedrals, let's consider the why. Why were cathedrals built? David McCauley begins his children's picture book, Cathedral, with this explanation. For hundreds of years, the people of Europe were taught by the church that God was the most important force in their lives. If they prospered, they thanked God for his kindness. If they suffered, they begged for God's mercy, for likely he was punishing them. In the 13th century, God was especially good to the people of France. The alliance of a powerful monarchy and an equally powerful clergy helped spread peace, prosperity, and learning across the land. The population grew, crops were plentiful, and business was booming. There were no wars to fight, at least on French soil, and the Great Plague wasn't even a twinkle in some flea's eye. God's blessings were evident, and nowhere more so than in the cities. To express their gratitude and to help ensure that he would continue to favor them, many of these vibrant and thriving communities undertook the building of new cathedrals of unprecedented scale and magnificence. So certainly there was a religious motive for building cathedrals. How could there not be? We can all appreciate the desire to praise and glorify God that inspired the construction of cathedrals. But there are some aspects of civic pride and competition involved as well. It is not hard to think that this might have been the motivation of some secular authorities or even among bishops themselves. But McCauley touches on some of the other reasons as well for why cathedrals were able to be built at this time when he mentions that crops were flourishing and business was booming. How about climate change as one factor? In the period from about 950 to 1100, something now known as the medieval warm period or the medieval climate optimum occurred, possibly due to increased solar activity, decreased volcanic activity, and changes in ocean circulation. This was not a globally uniform event, but one result in Western Europe was a warming of the climate so that more food was produced by fewer people. The population grew and other economic opportunities became available to people no longer needed to fill the earth. Some of these people began to congregate in larger towns and cities and became artisans. There was now a population of workers available for massive building projects. The merchant class developed and some grew wealthy, expanding the numbers of people who might be patrons or contributors to large construction projects. So in some ways, we had a perfect storm of new technology and building techniques, economic prosperity to support large construction projects, a more diversified and available workforce, developing urban communities with civic pride, all of this overlaid on a deep and abiding religious faith. Now that we have this background, let's visit some cathedrals, starting with Saint-Denis in Paris, which is usually considered the first Gothic cathedral, which is interesting because technically, originally, it was not a cathedral at all, not being the seat of a bishop, but it was an abbey church. Why might an abbey need a large church? Well, to tie this presentation to another one I made, abbey churches frequently had holy relics that could be used to make the abbey a place of pilgrimage for both sacred and economic benefit to the abbey and its environments. Back to Saint-Denis, which was a Benedictine abbey at the time of its construction, but is now recognized as the first church to use all the elements of Gothic cathedral architecture. Who was Saint Denis anyway? Saint Denis is the patron saint of France and Paris. Scholars actually believe that there are three distinct historical figures who have gotten intertwined into the Saint Denis legend, but for simplicity's sake, we'll stick to the most widely recognized one. Saint Denis was a bishop of Paris in the 3rd century whose skill at converting people to Christianity alarmed the authorities of the time. With 2 companions, he was martyred by beheading, probably during the persecutions under Emperor Decius, on the highest hill in Paris, which is how many believe Montmartre, Mount of the Martyrs, got its name. What is unusual about Saint Denis, Saint-Denis, though, is that he picked up his head and walked several miles while preaching a sermon on repentance. Did you know that there's actually a word for someone who is depicted in art carrying their own severed head? I did not. But the word is cephalophore, and St. Denis is the most famous cephalophore in Christian legend. A Christian woman buried him, and a chapel was raised on the site, which was later expanded into an abbey and a basilica. Notre Dame actually claimed to have at least part of his head, and his relics have been relocated several times, but that's a whole nother story. The original basilica became a place of pilgrimage and the burial place for almost every French king from the 10th to the 18th centuries, although the church became a prime target of revolutionary vandalism, with the tombs removed and the remains scattered. The church was reconsecrated by Napoleon and the tombs returned after the restoration of the monarchy, and the church was heavily restored in the mid-19th century. But back to the 12th century, to Abbot Suger, who in 1122 began rebuilding portions of the abbey church using innovative structural and decorative features, and this has given him pride of place as overseeing the first truly Gothic building. Note that Suger gets all the credit for this building, but he was not the actual architect. It is generally felt that there were two master masons, anonymous as so many cathedral builders are, who can be distinguished by stylistic differences. Abbot Suger was the instigator, however, interested in enlarging his abbey church to accommodate ever larger crowds of pilgrims. To justify the need for expansion, he wrote, "On special days, such as the Feast of the Blessed Denis, when the narrowness of the place forced women to run to the altar on the heads of men as on a pavement with great anguish and confusion." Saint Denis, as you see it today, has only one spire, the 282-foot northern spire having been dismantled in the 1840s following a lightning strike and a later violent storm. The stones were preserved and stored for later reconstruction. After several false starts in 2016, the Ministry of Culture again proposed its reconstruction, which has been deemed to be technically feasible at a cost of 28 million euros and 11 years. This was to be done by donation only, no public funds, and the work began in May of this year. I do not know the extent to which the fundraising program may have been affected by Notre Dame's similar appeal. Let's do a quick check of the features of the Gothic Cathedral as we discussed. Cruciform design with a mortuary chapel added some centuries later. Vaulted ceiling, flying buttresses, a triforium or gallery above the nave, a rose window, elaborate statuary. Yes, definitely we see the start of the Gothic Cathedral here. The new structure was finished and dedicated in June 1144 in the presence of the king and became the prototype for further building in the royal domain of northern France. Through the Angevin dynasty, the style was introduced to England and spread through France, the Low Countries, Germany, Spain, northern Italy, and Sicily. Our next visit is to Notre Dame de Chartres, which is where I first fell in love with the Gothic Cathedral in September 1975. I was not on a tour, but upon arrival, I fell in with a British man who was soliciting English-speaking tourists to whom he wished to give a tour of the cathedral, hoping to be rewarded with tips. It was a gorgeous fall day with bright sunlight and huge puffy white clouds that moved through the sky, quickly blown by the wind. The effect was to make the interior of the cathedral breathe as it turned dark and light by turns, with the windows throwing colorful rainbows and prisms of light on the stonework. The guide knew the cathedral intimately, and it was his instruction that first alerted me to all the hidden messages and meanings that could be found in even the smallest details of these great buildings. Over the centuries, Chartres has been the site of 5 different cathedrals, all devastated by fires, some deliberate, like 858 firing by Danish pirates, and others accidental. The cathedral has always been a pilgrimage site, its most famous relic being this cloak of the Virgin Mary that Charlemagne is said to have brought back from Jerusalem and donated to the church. Like many legends, this needs to be taken with a grain of salt, since Charlemagne never actually went to Jerusalem. It is a World Heritage Site, which UNESCO calls a masterpiece. The cathedral, we know it as we know it today, has seen only minor changes since the 13th century. One of the most obvious changes is the North Tower, which was destroyed by lightning and rebuilt around 1510 in the flamboyant style, quite different from the 1160 South Tower. And the reason you can tell the North and South Towers on Gothic cathedrals is that the front of the cathedral is almost always on the west. These cathedrals were started building at the top or the apse on the east end and built out. So when you look at the front of a cathedral, you can think, this is west, so the one on the left has to be the north and the one on the right has to be the south. Of the 175 famed stained glass windows in Chartres, about 150 are original, having been taken out and hidden during the period in World War II when the cathedral was used by the German army as a social club. Can you imagine the jigsaw puzzle of reassembling these windows after the war? A single lancet might have as many as 50 panels. In 1134, a fire destroyed the facade of the existing Romanesque cathedral, and when the new facade was built, the one you see here, it was built in the Gothic style. 60 years later, another fire destroyed the cathedral behind this facade. Everything was destroyed but the new facade. So when the rest of the cathedral was rebuilt, it was done in the Gothic style. Since Chartres is most well known for its sculpture and its windows, that's what we will look at here. I'm going to try to pick out some of the statuary and windows to give you a sense of how much there is to see and learn in a Gothic cathedral. Here is the west portal central tympanum with Christ seated on a throne, surrounded by the symbols of the evangelists: a winged man for St. Matthew, a lion for St. Mark, a bull for St. Luke, and an eagle for St. John. You may remember these four figures from the book of Revelation, or earlier from the book of Ezekiel. The tympanum of the left door depicts Christ on a cloud, supported by two angels with figures representing the labors of the month and the signs of the zodiac. If you are startled to see the signs of a zodiac in a cathedral, you should know that this is actually one of the common themes in cathedrals. The zodiac represents our life on earth, the life we lead before we meet Christ in heaven. There is also a zodiac stained glass window inside. Here we have St. Anne holding the infant Mary at one of the trumeaux, the space that appears between the doorways, and now jammed statues of the New Testament figures, Simeon, John the Baptist, and St. Peter with his keys. And finally, a detail of angels looking down on souls in hell. While I've picked out images that I could readily find to share, the takeaway for you to remember is that each part of the cathedral has a unified theme that is depicted in its stonework. And you can see on this chart of some of the areas how those themes tie together. And something to keep in mind, not all the imagery at Chartres is biblical. We've already talked about the zodiac, but because this is a cathedral dedicated to Mary, there is significant representation of her life and also St. Anne, none of which are from the Bible. And Charlemagne has a window. And this is the stained glass window of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The chart shows how the narrative proceeds and is connected to the story of creation. This linking of Old and New Testament is common throughout the cathedral. Another set of windows depicts the four gospelers standing on the shoulders of Old Testament prophets. And here is the root of the tree of Jesse, and it follows Christ's genealogy as you move upward in the window. And here's another example of a non-biblical allegory well known to medieval worshipers. The pelican was believed to feed its nestlings with its own blood. Thus, the pelican represents Christ, who saved us through his sacrifice, which is recreated in the Eucharist. You can see that this is just one panel in a larger window, so you can begin to appreciate how many stories there are to absorb in a cathedral like Chartres. And we will take a final look at the most famous Chartres window, the Belvedere, sometimes called the Blue Madonna, the blue of which has never exactly been replicated. Before we leave Chartres, I want to take a minute to describe how close we came to losing this masterpiece in World War II. In July 1944, as Allied forces were moving east, the Americans ultimately came to Chartres. They believed the towers and steeples were being used by German artillery, and an order came down to destroy the cathedral. American Colonel Barton Griffin, his West Point picture here, Jr., questioned the order and, accompanied by a volunteer soldier, decided to go to the cathedral and verify German occupation. When he found the cathedral empty, he rang the bells as a signal, causing the American command to rescind the order for destruction, saving the cathedral. Colonel Griffin died in combat later that same day.
Oh, wow.
It makes you appreciate just how miraculous it is that we still have so many of these wonderful cathedrals that have lasted through the centuries. Now we're going to jump ahead several centuries to visit the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, or as it is better known to us, the Washington National Cathedral. Since it is likely that most of you have visited this church, I'm not going to spend so much time on its story. But in 1791, when Pierre L'Enfant developed his plan for the District of Columbia, he envisioned the presence of a great church for national purposes such as public prayer, thanksgiving, and funeral orations, equally open to all. Unlike the National Mall, the White House, and the Capitol, this great national church did not get built until the 20th century. Recognize this? This was the initial design from 1895. This Beaux-Art design was later rejected in favor of the Gothic design we now have because Bishop Henry Yates Satterley insisted that Gothic was God's style, because no other architecture style could inspire religious feeling to nearly the same degree. And the cathedral has all of the usual Gothic characteristics: cruciform design, flying buttresses, stained glass windows, elaborate statuary, and of course, gargoyles. Here are some of the favorite gargoyles, including the famous Darth Vader one. What is different, however, is that for this cathedral, we actually know the names of the artists whose talents adorn the cathedral. For example, Frederick Hart's Ex Nihilo portrays the dawning of creation and sits below the rose window creation created by Rohan Lecomte. Lecomte and his wife Irene are responsible for 42 of this cathedral's stained glass windows. The cathedral's foundation stone, laid in 1907, has at its heart small rocks from a field adjoining the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, surrounded by a massive block of American granite inscribed with the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The trowel used to spread the mortar was the one used by George Washington to install the cornerstone of the Capitol. The nave's bicentennial dedication was attended by President Ford and Queen Elizabeth, and the finial marking the building's completion was set in 1990. The entire project was supported by private donations. From the beginning, this cathedral had a dual role, certainly as an Episcopal place of worship, but also meeting L'Enfant's original purpose as a great church for national purposes. To serve the second purpose as the nation's spiritual home, the cathedral has always been, although not always without controversy, a place where the public convenes for interfaith dialogue and worship and to address issues of national importance. The Canterbury pulpit, so named because the stone came from Canterbury, has been occupied by, among others, the Reverend Billy Graham, the Dalai Lama, and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in his final Sunday sermon 4 days before his assassination. And because of its second role as a national church, some of the artwork commemorates historical figures and events as well as saints and biblical figures. Here we see James Madison, the Lewis and Clark expedition, Iwo Jima, the Space Window, and Robert E. Lee. Several years ago, the cathedral made the decision to remove stained glass windows donated by the United Daughters of the Confederacy to honor Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and which displayed the Confederate flag. Another recent event affecting the cathedral was the 2011 earthquake. Phase 1 repairs costing $10 million were completed in 2015. Phase 2 repairs, estimated at over 22 million, will take 10 years and are awaiting funding. Like other Gothic cathedrals, the artwork at this cathedral tells many stories. And since it is so close to us, it provides a good opportunity for a visit to practice our skill at reading everything the cathedral has to teach us. I also want to briefly visit our own cathedral, the Cathedral Shrine of the Transfiguration at Shrinemont, which was consecrated in 1925. It is obviously not a Gothic cathedral, having none of the architectural features necessary for such a designation, but it is nevertheless our cathedral. Each of its stones of the cathedral was pulled by horse or rolled by local people from the mountain that embraces it. The baptismal font was originally a dugout stone used by Indians to grind corn. But like all cathedrals worldwide, it is a place for the devout to worship and glorify God. And in some ways, perhaps you can say that the glory of God's creation is so immediately visible to worshipers here that you do not need the intervention of elaborately vaulted ceilings, colorful stained glass windows, or an impressive statuary to remind us of God's awesome power. As much as we at Resurrection love our cathedral, it might surprise you to know that there have been 2 attempts over the years to replace or at least supplement it. I won't go into details today, but look for an article about this in the November issue of Inspire, and you will learn what a pro-cathedral is. In addition to the many, many, many websites, here are the resources I used in preparing this presentation. I'd be happy to take your questions or to hear your own stories about your favorite cathedrals. And please plan to join me in a few weeks when we will visit some more cathedrals in England, Italy, Spain, and maybe elsewhere if there is time, and learn about their stories and the artwork used to express the faith of their builders and worshipers.